I'm Michael Bender, one of the partners, one of the 6 partners here, and we're pleased that you're here today. This is our 20th annual market outlet hosted by Bender Commercial, and on behalf of our whole team, not only the 6 partners, but the other 40 members of our team, we're pleased to have you here. We hope that this information, as we have every year, is valuable for your decision making for the coming year. And so this will be no different. We hope we provide good, accurate information that you can make trusted decisions on. Well, with the theme of 20 years, we're going to be looking back some and looking forward some. I made a couple of really good decisions a number of years ago. 33 years ago, I married way above my head, and I married Jean. 25 years ago, I moved to Sioux Falls, and that was another great decision. 20 years ago, we started Bender Commercial, but somewhere along the way, I made a really bad decision, as you can see here, with my wardrobe. Since then, my wife does pick out my wardrobe, so I'm in better shape now. Well, as we were thinking about this year's event, and I was doing research, it really occurred to me that we're living in kind of 2 parallel worlds in the business world. And sometimes those worlds can give you us a clue as to the worlds socially, politically, etc. Right now, it seems like there's the word-making world or business and the thing-making world. In that word-making world, it's the coastal elites, the politicians, the bureaucrats, the consultants, the academia, the lawyers. And they seem to be making more and more regulations, more and more words, if you will, and place them onto the things-making world. Those word makers have the First Amendment to protect themselves. The things makers don't. The things makers are manufacturers, agricultural, producers, a guy right here flipping hamburgers. So that led me to the next thought, which was, I wonder whether we really are overregulated or not. So I started researching the World Bank, and they do a great survey every year about the ease of doing business in each country. Now, before we get to the U.S., I want to just make a point with this slide here. I picked 2 countries that are very similar in size, in population, both industrialized. And by just these couple of data points, you should be able to know which country is probably better off economically. We all know the problems Greece is having. 24.7% unemployment, rampant problems with their social issues. And so Israel, 4.5% unemployment rate. Well, one data point doesn't make an economy, I realize that, but it does tell you an indicator as to where a society is heading economically. So how's the U.S. doing? Well, you can see I tightened the band a little bit. I just picked the last 7 years during President Obama's term, and you can see we are slipping a little bit on a number of categories. I threw one up there about property rights as well. Just the cost of registering property has gone up. Now, we're all leaders in the community here, and so I want to kind of bring that up from a local level as well, because I can think anecdotally of some examples locally where we tend to allow regulations maybe to get ahead of ourselves. Good example here locally is right in Sioux Falls when you rezone a property. 5 years ago, it cost probably $500 and 60 days, and you'd have a property rezoned. Fast forward to today, the city won't accept a permit to rezone without a preliminary development plan. A preliminary development plan will cost you $5,000 to $7,000 to produce. And it'll probably take you 90 to 120 days to get that property rezoned. Now, I fully acknowledge that there probably were some things that were lacking for the planning department to figure out whether that property should be rezoned or not. And they needed more information, but I'm just not so sure they needed that quite detailed information at that cost to the property owner. So that's just an example. So what's the result of this overregulation? Well, this study from George Mason University shows that it's cost the U.S. economy about $4 trillion in lost GDP. That's lost jobs, lost housing, lost quality of life, you name it. It's cost us about 0.8 of a percentage point off our GDP for all those years. So you can see the significant impact that has. In fact, the Wall Street Journal puts out a study, and every year they determine how many rules or regulations are placed on our economy that cost $100 million or more to enforce. So they place that on the private sector. For the last 8 years under President Obama, either by executive order, most of them were executive order, or legislative action, there were 650 rules or regulations that cost the economy $100 million or more to enforce per year. Lest you think that's just a Democratic issue, it isn't. Under President Bush, George W. Bush, the prior 8 years, there were 450 of those same types of rules. So again, we've been inundated with regulations. And I'm not going to make comments about where we're heading forward. I really want this to be a discussion about us in the room as to what we can do locally about that. Well, is it really that bad? When we compare ourselves with ourselves, it seems bad when I bring up some of these rules and regulations. But when we compare ourselves really with the rest of the world, we're still the envy of the rest of the world. And, you know, we should be proud of the economy that we have. We should be proud of the society that we have. It just seems like we're just in a negative position day in and day out. And I don't want to get on my soapbox, but it just seems like we have legal institutions, social institutions, financial institutions that are the envy of the world, and yet we still hear day in and day out from Fox News and other places how bad it is. Certainly those last two categories you would not hear on Fox News, would you? Well, shifting gears a little bit now, the last couple of market outlooks, I've introduced some topics that were, in one particular case, I got accused by my conservative friends of channeling Bill Clinton when we talked about income inequality and the effects of income inequality to our economy and to our society. That was 2 years ago. Last year we talked about productivity, or the lack of productivity gains in our economy. This year I think this subject matter is tied to those both, but it's the long-term effects that technology is going to have really on our economy going forward. You know, we really are entering, at the turn of the century, a new revolution. Some call it the fourth industrial revolution. There was a good book written 2 years ago, published 2 years ago, by a couple of economists called the Second Machine Revolution. I kind of like that phrase better. I recommend you read it. But it's marked by rapid innovation, by advances in healthcare, advances in financial, societal advances, all kinds of advances, all framed a bit around artificial intelligence, or AI. So what is AI? There's a lot of definitions out there. The first half of the definition is pretty scary. The second half is what I want you to focus on. It's opportunistic. This is where the opportunity is. That we can harness AI and we can make it a benefit and come alongside human activity to make us more productive as a society. So I want to really just get you thinking about AI. From a local level, I started thinking about AI and I thought, you know, probably the most prominent part of AI that you hear about is the driverless car, or the autonomous vehicle right now. And I know that our mayor's in the audience, a number of city council members are in the audience, and they are right in the middle of debating a brand new $20 million parking ramp downtown. So I got to thinking about the effects of artificial intelligence. And as we plan that next parking ramp, we should consider a few things. Do you realize you only spend 5% of your time in that car moving? The rest of that time, 95%, that car's parked somewhere. If we adopt AI and it continues to take over, and for instance, an autonomous vehicle, we're going to see more and more ride sharing, we're going to need 60% less space to house that automobile than we have today. So we better be designing parking ramps, like right here in Sioux Falls, that are flat floor, not slope floor, that are 12 foot in floor to ceiling, so that we can adaptively reuse that space at a later date. Because what you're going to see is, you're going to see lofts, office space, retail, whatever, is going to get transitioned into that space over a period of time. Well, I like this quote from a German-born economist. He immigrated to the United States. He won a Nobel Prize in the mid-'80s. He was talking about AI before it was AI, when you think about it. And why I like this is because this is nothing new to America, right? We shifted from an agrarian economy quite well to an industrial economy. And for 100 years, we've dominated the economic scene around the world. So we should embrace this next shift with a lot of optimism that we can do it. There are some issues there, and we're going to talk about some of those issues right now. You know, unlike the 20th century, where employment and productivity rose at a very consistent pattern, we're seeing a drop in private employment to productivity. This is, I know there's a couple of trained economists out in the audience, and this is a classic economic polarized labor market. And what we're seeing is our society right now has the lowest participation rate for labor in the last 50 years. 62% of the workforce participates to work right now. Now, some of that, I realize, is probably economic from the last recession. I believe, and many economists believe, that a lot of that is structural. And it's due to the lack of skill sets for our workforce. And so if we think we're going to solve that by doing the same things over and over again, we're going to be sorely mistaken, and we're going to see even less labor participation going forward and more issues going forward. Well, with that in mind, what jobs are at risk in this new economy that we're talking about? Anything with big data, either retrieval, analytical, storage, clearly is at risk. You can see here from this, there's a number of different things that are going to be affected. What I really want to direct your attention to, though, is that study that I quoted there, because that's an alarming number. Most of the studies I read were anywhere from 35 to 50% of all U.S. jobs are either going to be eliminated or structurally totally revamped over the next 20 years. And if you think of that, and you think about the social chaos that could create, if we don't figure out how to retrain those people, we've got a lot of work ahead of us. Well, what jobs are going to flourish? You can see here, I broke them into three main categories. Manual labor, very creative type jobs, and then interpersonal. You know, the interpersonal one I like to focus on is the elementary school teacher. They were very clear in the research I read that high school teachers are going to diminish. We're going to see more distance learning at the high school level. But at the elementary school level, there's going to be a lot more encouragement and that interpersonal dialogue with the students. And so it's going to be interesting to see what we look like 20 years from now. You're going to hear a phrase more and more often called no-shoring. Instead of companies offshoring jobs, what you're going to hear is they no-shore those jobs, meaning they basically brought it back and eliminated the jobs altogether with a computer. So don't be surprised that you hear that phrase coming in the future. Well, where do we go from here? You know, I really think that it's incumbent upon us, especially right here in this room, to really work on breaking down those silos between education, industry, and kind of leadership. And we're going to have to adapt our education process here as we go forward. Now, Sioux Falls has done some good things in that area already. The CTE Academy is a perfect example of that. A high school student can go to their traditional high school in the morning. They can attend the CTE Academy that afternoon. And and there's 40 different programs they can go to and take advantage of for technical training. Build the Code Scholarship's another example of that, where the state has partnered with the private sector to fund it, and then now Sioux Falls has come alongside the private sector as well. And there's scholarships available for retraining either the high school student or someone that's already been in the workforce but needs retraining. So again, I turn to you all and say it's incumbent upon us to figure this out. And it's with that in mind that we at Bender Commercial would like to announce that we formed a foundation this year in honor of our 20th anniversary. And we funded that foundation. We're working closely with the Sioux Falls Area Foundation to administer it. And the details aren't totally worked out yet. But what we want to do is we want to be part of the solution right here in Sioux Falls. And again, I would throw that back to everyone here. It doesn't have to be a foundation, but there's all kinds of opportunities for all of us to be part of that solution as we transition our society over the next 15 to 20 years. If we do that and we embrace the coming changes that are already we've seen and are right upon us, this study from Accenture points out what happens if we see AI as an opportunity, not as a fear that it's going to replace the private sector. And you can see here that it can increase our GDP right here in the United States by 200 basis points. I mean, that's a huge increase. These politicians all talk about how we're going to get to 4 or 5% GDP again, and there's going to be a transformational, systematic change in order for us to do that. Well, I want to shift gears now and talk about the Sioux Falls economy. We always start this part of the section with jobs, and this year is no different. You can see the U.S. economy grew by about 1.8% last year. I showed that in a slide earlier. Very steady, healthy growth at the U.S. economy. South Dakota, let's see how they did. They were also at 1.8%. They were up a little bit, actually, surprisingly. They went up a couple, about 1.6 to 1.8, and that surprised me given the fact that ag is such a drag right now on our economy on a statewide level. So we did a little research, and it turns out a lot of those jobs are construction-related jobs. So that should come as no surprise. How'd Sioux Falls do? 3.7% unemployment gain. That's a phenomenal number. In fact, it's a record of what we've been keeping track of. Now, there could very well be a higher percentage point gain at an earlier time, but that's the highest percentage point that we've seen in increase. That's a huge number. Now, let's look at it in raw data in gross numbers. This is the Sioux Falls MSA. So that's our 4 counties in our metropolitan area. Non-farm jobs, and it's seasonally adjusted. We capped out about 155,000 new jobs, or total jobs, last year. And that was up from about 150. So we created 5,000 new jobs in our community just last year alone. Huge numbers, record numbers of new jobs. Well, new jobs relate to new permits and new construction. So let's look how we did. Now, this is a number I think everybody's heard already. $701 million in total construction permits last year. That was a record, you can see again. About 450 of that million was in commercial, the rest was in residential. I think Mike Cooper's in the audience. I didn't see him come in, but I know he was coming. Mike and I kind of keep a running bet every year. A gentleman's bet, I should say, so I don't get him in trouble with the city. But a running bet every year as to what our total production will be for the year in total construction. And I'm here to tell you that I've lost that bet 3 years in a row. I've underestimated the robust nature of our Sioux Falls economy when it comes to construction. So you'll hear some predictions here in a little bit, but and I may be 0 for 4 at the end of this next year. Who knows? We're breaking this number down a little further. This slide gives you an indicator whether we're in a contracting economy or we're entering or in a expanding economy. And we highlighted the last major contraction for you. When addition remodel outpaces new construction, you tend to go into a contracting economy? Well, you can see here that new construction is easily at a 2-to-1 ratio to addition remodel. I suspect and I predict easily that in 2017 and beyond, in 2018, we're going to see that same healthy ratio of about 2-to-1 new construction to addition remodel. We'll break it down a little further now. The new construction, I want you to focus on the red bar there. That's the industrial market. And the industrial market's kind of the steady eddy of our industry. We've averaged $10 to $15 million just about every year in that category. The blue is office. Office is predominantly medical and financial services. So you can imagine it goes up. It's pretty high usually. It's about 45 or 50 million last year. I think you're going to hear some major announcements in 2017 that are going to cause that office construction number to spike up pretty dramatically in 17 and 18. The green bar is retail, and I'm going to leave Reggie in his presentation to tell you and let you imagine whether you think retail is going to go up or down based on some of the things he's going to talk about. Well, some examples of the new construction and the addition remodel. There's some major large-scale projects. There's tons of million-dollar projects, but then you tend to see the ones that stand out are the 10, 15, and $20 million projects. The one I do like to point out is that Cars for Sale. That's a beautiful building over at Lake Lorraine. If you haven't seen it, take a look at it over on the west side. And a comparison, we like to compare Sioux Falls to other communities. And I really like to compare them to the ones that we compete with on a day in and day out basis. Fargo, Lincoln, sometimes Omaha, Des Moines, certainly. And you can see on a per capita basis, you know we're much smaller than some of those other, certainly Lincoln and Des Moines are much smaller, and yet we're significantly higher on a per capita basis, our new construction. So again, this room is the leadership. We should take pride in what we've done and where we've been, but there's a lot of work going forward in this area. Well, wrapping it up on an outlook, I would tell you that we're not going to have probably 3.7, 3.8% job growth next year. Most indicators tell me that it's going to be 2.5, 2.4 to 2.5%. That roughly equates to about 3,000 new jobs. Not a record year, but a very strong year for new job growth coming into 2017. I'll let you decide what the construction is going to be based on the examples that you're going to hear from the various segments when my partners get out. I will comment on residential, though. Residential, Nick's going to talk about multifamily, and residential clearly is overbuilt on the multifamily side. I really think on the residential single-family side is probably going to be pretty stable. Finally, what I want to do is introduce you to the real estate cycle. We've used this for a number of years on our report, and I just want you to see it and think through it, because as you hear the reports from my partners, you can imagine where you think they're going to place 2016 and 2017 on that. It starts with the recovery, and you continue to build. You build more supply. You have a pretty good run-up of supply. You get expansion, and then all of a sudden maybe a little bit too much expansion, and you get an oversupply, and you're in that hyper supply, and then you drop down to a recession, and the cycle starts all over again. So keep that in mind as you hear the reports as we go forward. And with that, what I'm going to do is introduce Reggie and have Reggie come up and talk about the retail and the land market. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. As he said, I'll be presenting on the land and retail sectors today. Before I do get started, I do want to say a special thanks to Mike Cooper, Jeff Schmidt, and the city planning staff for the data that we have, especially in the land report. Well, 20 years ago, I was a 7th grader in Platte. I was also the proud owner of a bait shack behind my dad's hardware store. I used to count by the dozen. Now I multiply by 6%. That seems to work out even better. Sticking with 20 years. Sioux Falls, in 1997, our population was about 114,000. The eastern edge of our city was basically Sycamore Avenue. Southern was roughly 57th Street. It did stretch a little further south as we went along Minnesota. western end from Sertoma and I-90 to the north. Let's look at today. As the business community, we've all been blessed by taking care of and enjoyed the growth of our city. We're almost at 180,000 people. In those 20 years, the city has annexed almost 18,000 acres. They've issued over 150,000 building permits for a whopping $8.5 billion worth of construction. We've also added 14 new elementary schools in those 20 years. Well, we're going to start the land market by defining it. The land on the edge of the city, generally the ag lands, and primarily purchased by the development community, is bought on a per acre basis. After they've added infrastructure, taken it through the city with the entitlement process, and stuff utilities into the lot, they sell it on a per square foot basis, and that's where we get retail, office, industrial, and multifamily. Last year, we predicted that the unimproved land sales and the improved land sales would decrease, but pricing would hold pretty steady. Let's see how we did. The unimproved land sales did go down. They went down from 8 to 7. It's maybe not quite as big as a drop as we thought or we were expecting, but we noticed a really unique trend. Let's look at the transactions. 6 out of 7 of the bulk land transactions were in southern Sioux Falls. That's no surprise. The Lone Ranger up north was the Crossing Boys Ranch buying some adjacent land to their campus at a below market price. Let's go back to that unique trend. I want you to take a look at some of the size of these transactions. 12 acres, 14 acres, 21 acres. These are normally 40 or 60 or 80 or larger tracts of land. We think this is primarily being driven by 3 reasons. Number one, there's a bid-ask gap between the development community and the owners of that land, and I'll touch on that a little bit more here in a little bit. Number two, the entitlement process. Taking that through the city has gotten much more cost prohibitive in recent years. And number 3, and probably the primary reason, especially in southern Sioux Falls, is the lack of available sewer. There's just very limited pockets of sewer, so the developer is buying the smaller parcel on a larger tract. Well, one might ask, why is there no sewer available in southern Sioux Falls? Let's look at the last 5 years. These are the last 5 years of bulk land transactions in our city. And as you can see, about 7% of them are in southern Sioux Falls. We could almost overlay a sanitary trunk line right through the middle of those transactions. And as development is pushed south, we've used up a lot of that capacity. And I'll touch on a little bit more on that in my predictions here in a little bit. We're going to transition now and look at improved land. We're going to start with single-family building permits. The blue bar is your demand. That's the amount of single-family building permits that were pulled last year, as well as townhomes. The yellow bar is your supply, the amount of build-ready lots available today. Take a look at 2009, 10, 11. It didn't feel that good to be a developer back then. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a little bit. Compare that to today. In 2016, we have about a 2.5-year supply, which is a really healthy ratio for the development community. It feels a lot better. We're going to transition now to the commercial transactions. If you remember, we did predict that we would decrease last year, and we did. We went from 90 transactions last year to 76. Sales volume dropped from about 60 million to 54. And we're going to break those transactions down a touch more here. There's a lot of data on this slide. I really want you to focus on 2 things. The retail run-up in the last 4 years and multifamily in the last 3. As far as retail is concerned, as our city has approached and now surpassed a critical mass of about 250,000 people in our metro area, retailers have taken note, they've committed to and invested in our city. And this is primarily being driven by new developments at Dolly Farm, Lake Lorraine, and 85th in Minnesota. As far as multifamily, we've seen more transactions in the last 3 years than the previous 7 combined. And Nick's going to tell you a little bit about what that's doing to the fundamentals in the multifamily market. Pricing, I could probably give you an entire presentation on this slide alone. Really, we've given you the outliers, the high, the low, and an average. The simple takeaway here is that retail is the most sensitive to both location and access. Office is also sensitive to location, and industrial and multifamily are simply less sensitive in their less desirable locations. The average commercial real estate, commercial retail property will sell for about $12.50 a square foot in Sioux Falls. Office property is about $6.40, and industrial multifamily range from about $2.50 to $3.25 a square foot. So predictions for 2017, we'll We again think that there will be a drawdown, a drawback in some of the unimproved land sales. It's primarily being driven by that bid-ask gap. The developers and their bankers, many of you sitting in the audience, do remember that building permit slide in 2009, 10, and 11. Development communities simply not willing to overpay for land right now. We think that the improved land sales and pricing will hold pretty steady. And as I mentioned previously, there's limited pockets of available sewer in southern Sioux Falls, which will continue to develop and fill in. But over the next 24 to 36 months, I think you're going to see a lot of activity on the east side of Sioux Falls, especially in that Veterans Parkway corridor from Dolly Farm down to 57th Street. We're going to move on to the retail sector now. We're going to start with some macro trends that are affecting the United States. Some of them have hit home right here in Sioux Falls. And then we'll hone in right at Sioux Falls at the end. We're going to look at consumer spending. We're going to talk about Amazon again this year, e-commerce. We're going to look at a big buzzword you're going to hear a lot about is the last mile, which is really same-day delivery. And we're going to talk about malls and the big boxes. Let's look at consumer spending for a minute. This is a chart from the Federal Reserve Bank. This is your general retail goods. This is your automobiles and food. Look at the run-up out of the last recession. We're spending a lot of discretionary income. That got us to thinking, I wonder how that compares to our personal savings rate. Let's look. I want you to focus on two things on this slide. Look at the gap in 2007 and look at the gap today. We're simply not saving enough. Number one, to take advantage of the next contracting economy, or number two, to withstand the next contracting economy. This could lead to some pain down the road. Amazon. It's not reported, but it's estimated that Amazon has 50 to 60 million Prime members. 70% of U.S. households with $100,000 or more of annual income are Prime members. They have a massive distribution network, over 120 warehouses in the United States. They're focusing on the last mile now, which is really same-day delivery, and I'll touch on that in a little bit, and leading to some urban warehousing. We think they're probably 5 years ahead of their competition. It's really setting up to be an epic battle between Walmart and Amazon going forward. Recently, in September, Walmart announced that they bought Jet.com in an effort to directly compete with Amazon for online sales. A couple weeks ago, Walmart also announced that they're going to offer free shipping, 2-day shipping, on all orders over $35. And in return, Amazon said that they're going to start accepting food stamps. So you can already see this retail giant tug of war that we're going to start to see play out over the next few years. There's a lot of runway to burn in this industry. Only 8.4% of all retail sales are made online. How big of a market is that? It's about $400 billion, a $5 trillion annual industry. So there's more to come here. The last mile. Amazon is already beating its competition on selection and pricing. Now they're going to go for the jugular, delivery. In an effort to give us, the consumer, instant gratification, they're going to focus on same-day delivery. And they've rolled out a new program called Amazon Prime Now, where they do have same-day delivery. Let me introduce you. Who can sign up for that? Well, about 1 in 4 Americans, about 80 million can. I'd look for them to add additional markets in the coming year. And this is the retail of the future, with the eventual goal of getting us, the consumer, goods within 1 to 2 hours of clicking buy. Well, our partner, Doug Brackhouse, is a huge biker. He loves to bike. He's told us a few times that he kind of wants to start slowing down a little bit. We think we found the perfect retirement vehicle for Doug. Amazon has also toyed with the idea of a drone delivery, and they've tested it. A fun fact about Amazon, a futuristic fact, they have a patent on a floating warehouse. So if you can picture a blimp carrying a warehouse with drones flying in and out, it's crazy, it's futuristic, but they're the trendsetter. We have to follow what they do. All right, malls and big boxes. Is the shopping mall dead? That's a hotly debated topic in retail. We don't think it's dead yet, but certainly the late to adapt big box retail is dying a slow death. We're seeing that right here in Sioux Falls. Sears and Kmart have announced they're closing 150 stores, and there's 2 of them right here in Sioux Falls. Macy's has announced they're closing 100 stores, and JCPenney is next on the chopping block. Many of the experts predict that they're going to close as many as 300 stores in the very near future. Also, who here thinks it might be a good idea for a landlord to buy your tenant? It's exactly what happened this year. Erica Stahl, a teen clothing retailer, filed bankruptcy. The two largest mall owners in the world, Simon Property and John McGrail, decided that they'd collaborate and buy them out of bankruptcy in an effort to save a 3,500 square foot tenant in million square foot malls. That makes no sense to me. That screams one word: desperation. All right, we're going to transition now to Sioux Falls. This is a slide that we look at every year. This is tenant-occupied space. And there's a lot of data here, but I want you to focus on two things. Look at Dolly Farm. 3 years ago on this stage, we looked at Dolly Farm, and they're at 18% vacancy. 2 years ago, they're at about 12. Last year, 7.5. They've added supply, they've absorbed it, and they're at 3% today. Dolly Farm has gotten very healthy in the last 24 months. Now take a look at Lake Lorraine. They've added supply, spiked their vacancy up to about 18%, but no really cause for concern. This is a growing pain of a new development, and I look for that number to come down here in the coming months. Transitioning from leasing now to sales in the retail sector. 2015, we had 40 transactions for $70 million. 2016, we had 40 transactions for $40 million. So what happened? Well, there's no real story here other than the fact that there were some major outliers in 2015. There were some really big retail sales transactions. 2016 was about $40 million, and we just sold a lot of Class B and C and second generation space. I would look for that number to spike back up in 2017, mostly led by the investment activity in the retail sector. Some areas to watch. Well, it's no surprise to anybody in here that we're going to see more announcements out of Lake Lorraine, Dolly Farm, and 85th in Minnesota in the next 12 months. So predictions for 2017 look kind of in a holding pattern for retail. Vacancy, rental rates, construction should all hold pretty steady. We do think that the sales will go back up again this year. Well, Michael gave us a definition of the real estate cycle already. And what I want you to focus in on here is really the peak-to-peak cycle. Retail tends to run pretty hot, and then it shuts off a little quicker than some of the other industries you're going to hear from. And the peak-to-peak cycle in retail in Sioux Falls is about 6 to 7 years. Where are we at in 2017 or 2016? Well, we think we're probably in the late stages of expansion based upon all the fundamentals. I'd now like to introduce Andy to present on the office market. Thank you.
Celebrating 20 years. We're really excited about it and are honored that all of you are here today. 20 years ago, I was not in 7th grade, but I did happen to just recently get married, adopted a couple dogs, and had just begun my career in the commercial real estate market. I looked very different 20 years ago, so did the Sioux Falls office market. We have 1/2 of the office space that we do today. And speaking of today, the inventory really has been stable over the past couple of years, currently sitting at 14.2 million square feet. Now, as I move forward, I only focus on the 7.7 million square feet of tenant-occupied space, due to the fact that owner-occupied doesn't affect our vacancy or our rental rates. Now, I break that 7.7 million square feet into two sectors. The first sector I like to focus on is the CBD or the Central Business District. Now, this sector's inventory really hasn't changed much either. However, with some completion of new projects, we'll see that inventory increase over the next year, really opening up opportunities for businesses and tenants to consider. And the vacancy rate in the CBD did drop this past year, down to 6.8%. Even though inventory has been tight, interest and activity still has been very strong. Now, you can't help but notice the consistent decline since 2009. Why is that? Well, we've had relatively few newly constructed office buildings and renovations taking place. And when we do see that happen, they're usually significantly pre-leased, resulting in that consistent decline in our rate. And when our vacancy rate drops, we see positive net absorption. And we had over 71,000 square feet of it. Now, I want to remind you what took place in 2014. We had a couple of buildings with large footprints come on the market. That space was leased in 2015, and 2016 followed suit with positive absorption. Now, with the completion of Washington Square and the former DM&E building, those will be welcomed additions to the downtown office market. Now we're going to shift to the suburban sector, and we had a slight uptick in inventory of 2.8% in the sector, currently sitting at 5.4 million square feet. Some examples of what added to that inventory: we had 5 newly constructed office buildings and 6 conversions take place. What I mean by conversions are, they went from owner-occupied to now tenant-occupied properties, therefore putting that square footage back into the inventory. And our vacancy rate dropped in this sector as well, as interest is still very strong, down to 8.9%. Now in 2015, we had 3 buildings that added a significant amount of square footage to this sector. Okay, there we go, sorry about that. And when that square footage was added, in 2016, half of that square footage was leased, resulting in a drop in the vacancy rate. But what it also resulted in was a huge positive net absorption number, over 300,000 square feet. Now that's a huge number. So with a drop in vacancy rate as well as such a large positive net absorption number, will that drive developers to go out and build speculative buildings? I predict we absolutely will see some take place. However, we'll just have to wait and see. Now we're going to shift gears and take a look at things as a whole. This slide represents our historic citywide vacancy rates. Now if you remember, both the CBD as well as the suburban sector had over a 3% drop in their vacancy rate, resulting in our overall dropping down to 8.2% as well. Now as we have historically been, we're always below the national vacancy rate, which is currently sitting at 14.5%. Some of you in the audience may be thinking, wow, we look really healthy at 8.2% here in Sioux Falls. But how low is too low? We really can't afford to let our office market get so tight. Options create interest and activity, and that's really important for the Sioux Falls office market. This slide represents our asking rental rates net of all expenses. Now with my prediction of speculative building taking place over the next year, I predict we're going to see Class A rental rates increase anywhere from 15 to 17%, and landlords of Class B space, I think that trend will follow suit with them as well. The increase may not be quite as significant, but they will see an increase nonetheless. And now switching gears from office leasing to office sales. We had 34 office buildings sell in 2016 with a total of $33.6 million in transactions. Now that's a huge number, and I was really impressed by that number, but what was even more interesting to me was the per square foot price in which those buildings sold for. We had office buildings sell at $50 a square foot, all the way up to $175 a square foot. And now as I do my research, I try to look at trends on a national level as well as a local level that could affect us. And one trend that I found interesting was really the repurposing of older buildings. With a lot of the new technological companies out there and millennials running new businesses, they really like that open interior concept design and more modern feel in their office space. So I think we're going to see a continuation of that repurposing of space from landlords to really draw those tenants to lease space. And is parking still an issue? Michael touched on some interesting parking ramp concepts that we can see change over the next several years. And I think parking really affects the office market more than really any other sector, just due to the fact that office densification is continuing to take place in office, meaning more bodies and less square footage. So parking has been a big concern. And I think it'll be really interesting to watch this trend over the next several years and what transition really takes place with parking. And people often say to me, do we really still need office space? I can go work out of Starbucks or my basement, or I can go to the library and get my work done. And my answer to that is absolutely. I think offices really create a cultural home. It creates friendships, bonds, ideas, energy, and activity, and I just think that's so important for any business to really thrive. And so, in my opinion, I think the feel of office space may be changing, but I think there will always be an absolute requirement for it. Now you're looking at the 20-year history of the office real estate cycle. Now, the office real estate cycle is much slower to react than, for example, Reggie's retail real estate cycle. And we're much more methodical in our climbs and methodical in our declines. And for a full cycle to be completed here, it really takes between 10 and 12 years. Now, in 2016, I have as an expansion, and I predict we're going to continue to stay in expansion even in 2017. I think it'll be a very conservative and steady and, again, methodical growth in office. And with that, I'd like to bring up Rob Edmond.
year. Looking back 20 years, freshman in high school. Boy, at that point in time, I had a very strategic plan in place. On top of trying to get my teeth straightened out, I was honing my skills as a professional busboy, trying to make just enough money to be able to splurge on a senior girl at prom. Unfortunately, I never got that invite. So, in light of 20 years, I thought it'd be important to really highlight one of the cornerstones of the industrial market here in Sioux Falls, and that's the Sioux Falls Development Foundation. They've been investing in our community over the past 60 years and really control the lion's share of industrial land in our market. If we look back to 1997, at that point in time, the Development Foundation had acquired and developed about 895 acres of ground consisting of 6 industrial parks. Fast forward to 2017, they added 4 more industrial parks, which brought their total to just over 2,100 acres. It's about 2.5 times where they were at 20 years ago. Now, currently, the Development Foundation and their industrial parks house about 13,000 employees. Well, with the recent addition of Foundation Park and some of the available land that remains in Park 8, it's our hope that we see that number double over the next 20 years. Okay, let's take a look at some of the various uses that make up the industrial market. If you haven't been with us in the past, we've kind of coined the phrase that if you can get a magnet to stick to it, it's more likely going to show up in this report. So for this year, I thought we would start off from a macro level and take a look at some national headlines regarding the U.S. industrial market. We're seeing mega warehouses being built, price increases, and strong manufacturing. Now, what are some of the driving factors behind these headlines? And there's really 5 core factors. The first being outsized demand. The availability of property right now across the country is not keeping up with absorption. So the flip side of that, and the second factor, is we're seeing a limited supply out there. And some of the reasons for this is there's a lack of entitlements right now around the country, and also the construction timelines are becoming longer and longer. As Michael had talked about earlier, about some of the regulations that's holding up some of these properties from being able to get built, and is really struggling to keep up with that demand. The third factor, Reggie already touched on it, e-commerce, and this is really what's driving all these mega warehouses to be built around the country. The fourth, and one that a lot of people don't really think a whole lot about, but is the data center industry. This is really the lifeblood that drives internet usage, digital data, backup, and e-commerce. Now, contrary to Reggie's floating warehouses up in the clouds with Amazon, when you hear people talk about cloud storage, it's actually probably sitting, that data is probably sitting in a facility like this that Google has. Lastly, research and development. We're seeing technology companies and manufacturing companies trying to consolidate costs by pulling their office and industrial uses together under one roof. An example of this would be a few years back, Sanford had purchased the old Touch Tech building on the north end of town for the corporate office and some research and development. And actually, Nick was involved in a transaction just recently up in Brookings, SGS. They're currently under construction on their building. Very similar type use. So, taking a look at these factors, let's see if any of them translate into our local market. Always like to take a look at our industrial universe here. This past year, Sioux Falls added 12 buildings to the survey, coming in just shy of about 17 million total square feet. If we look at T, that market's sitting right about 2.7 million. Not a whole lot of activity this past year down there, other than it was primarily a year of land acquisitions down there, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, traditionally, we've always looked at the difference between owner-occupied space and tenant-occupied space. And we continue to sit in that 70-30 range. I do think in the next year or two, we'll start to see that orange pie get a little bit bigger as we're seeing more and more build-to-suits take place. And owners of industrial property, when they go out and build new, they're oversizing their buildings to allow for tenants to lease that space and help pay for some of that new construction. So speaking of new construction, we've heard Michael talk year over year about all these record building permits and new construction. And it never really converted over from 2009 to 2014 into the industrial market. 2015, we saw a record year. And then for 2016, as we had predicted, it was going to be another strong year, second highest that we ever saw, coming in at about 500,000 square feet. Shifting gears to take a look at some of the new construction that took place this last year, just a few examples. Have you focus in on the perimeter pictures. Amesbury Truth, Feeding South Dakota, JDS Industries, Concordance Healthcare. All of them had new construction this past year that equated to, or that was anywhere from 50,000 square feet all the way up to 170,000 square feet. The Lone Wolf, the picture in the middle there was the only spec building that got built in Sioux Falls this past year, a 12,000 square footer. So let's jump into vacancy. You remember me talking about that limited supply on a national level? Well, we're seeing it right here in Sioux Falls as well. 3 years in a row, we've been sub 2% vacancy. This is the primary reason why we're seeing record construction numbers. Business owners can't find pre-existing buildings out there right now, so their only option is to go out, identify some land, and build new. I would like to point out in the T market, we did see a little over a 4% jump in vacancy down in that market. And that was primarily due to just a few buildings coming online, along with a couple smaller spec buildings. Net absorption, I talked about that outsized demand. Again, we're seeing it here on a local level. We've had 7 straight years of positive net absorption in our market. Another record year in 2016, topping out at 535,000 square feet being absorbed. Now, with the limited supply that we've seen, those 2% vacancy and the high demand that we're seeing, what I'm getting at here is over the next year, if nothing else got built, we would essentially be out of space within 6 months. So the industrial market is really tight right now. So it'd be good to continue to see some of this new construction happen in the future. Okay, switching gears to sales, total number of transactions. As predicted, we did see another drop in the total number of sales transactions from the previous year. We're sitting right around, I call this slide kind of a 30 for 30 this year. We had about $30 million in total dollars spent in the industrial market. And I think for 2017, we'll probably see another slight drop. Nick will talk about yields. We're talking about yields here in a little bit. And what industrial property owners are doing is they're holding tight on their tangible assets because they're happy with some of the yields that they're getting. We're just not seeing many properties come up for sale in the industrial market. All right, taking a look at the health of the leasing market, not a whole lot here to touch on, other than we saw about a 50-cent per square foot jump in Class A space. It's remained pretty consistent over the past year, and I think throughout the remainder of the year, we'll probably see right around the same prices. One last thing that I wanted to touch on before I jump into my conclusions and predictions, and that is the migration of companies out to some of these surrounding communities. We've been tracking and kind of reporting on this the past couple of years, and feel that we have a pretty good grasp of what's going on here. In the past year and a half, our company alone has been involved in 26 industrial land transactions down in the T market. So we've had plenty of time to talk to a lot of these business owners and ask them, why are you coming down to T to build? Well, some of the reasons include cheaper land, less regulation, no planning fees, and the ability to purchase 1 to 2 acre lots. It's really tough right now to find industrial lots in Sioux Falls in that 1 to 2 acre range. So I think we'll continue to see this trend throughout the remainder of the year and in the next couple of years. Okay, conclusions and predictions. I just told you we'll continue to see surrounding communities grow as people go out and build buildings in these areas. New construction, it was another strong year, and I think will remain at about the same, about 400,000 square feet or so for 2017. Sales transactions, again, we'll see a slight drop. People are not wanting to sell their properties right now. And for lease rates, I think we finally have topped out. It just doesn't make sense. You start getting up above some of those rates that I just showed you, and it makes a lot more sense for people to go out and build their own building. Onto the real estate cycle, the industrial market has remained pretty steady Eddie over the years. And so in this cycle, it's about every 10 years we'll see a full cycle in the industrial market. With low vacancies, high new construction, high absorption, for 2016, we continue to remain in that expansion column. And I think for 2017, we're going to be nearing the top of that curve. So with that, I'd like to bring up Nick Gustafson to present on the investment market.
Thank you, Rob. This is my 8th consecutive year presenting this outlook. I'd like to thank my partners and Summer Hoffman for making this such a success over the last 20 years. Now, speaking about 20 years, this was me 20 years ago. I was 15 years old, a freshman in high school. When I look at this picture, I feel hairline. But frankly, I'm not really sure I want to be my freshman year of high school all over again. Let's move on. Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the macro trends in the United States real estate investment market. We'll drill down to Sioux Falls, and then using this data and some deals we're already seeing in 2017, we'll make some predictions about the future. We love real estate. We think real estate investing is your best investment. But seriously, we realize that investors have a lot of vehicles to achieve a return. And this can range from sticking cash under a mattress, equities, bonds, early stage startups, or even the core career or business that made the money in the first place. Let's take a look at how some of these asset classes have fared in 2016. Clearly, equity investors were rewarded for taking some risk. Savers and CDs continue to get low returns, and a couple of commodities had a pretty good run in 2016. Let's talk real estate. Okay, there's a lot of information up here. These bars represent total sales volume in dollars in the U.S. Going back to 2001, the colors represent certain asset classes like multifamily, industrial, retail. Now, look at the run-up from 2001 to 2007. We did $500 billion worth of real estate transactions in 2007. Now, keep in mind, the U.S. commercial real estate market is $11 trillion. That's a lot of deals. We crashed in 2008 and 2009, and then we had a really nice run-up to 2015. In 2016, we were down roughly 10%. Now, I don't think we're going to crash. We're not going to crash like we did 08, 09, but I do think there will be some type of correction in the next 24 to 36 months. Now, when that correction happens, it's a question of what kind of hangover is it going to be. Is it a 1 bottle of wine hangover or a 3 bottle of wine hangover? You know, the first hangover you can shut off with a couple cups of coffee and breakfast. Well, that's a different presentation. Anytime you talk about the U.S. macro market, you have to talk about dry capital and foreign investment. In 2016, there was approximately $239 billion worth of capital waiting to invest in a U.S. real estate transaction. 57% of that was U.S. capital, 43% 83% of that was foreign capital. Regardless of what the market does over the next couple of years, there's going to be a lot of opportunistic buying as investors search for yield. Now, last year in 2016, real estate was added as the 11th sector of the S&P 500 index. And this chart shows the welfare that real estate investors have had with REITs since 2009. This is contracted with the struggling bank stocks in red. As regulatory winds may shift, look for this delta to decrease over the next few years. Cap rates. These are national cap rates of office, retail, hotels. There's a lot of numbers up here. What I want you to direct your attention to on the far right, these are negative numbers. What's happening? Well, in real estate, it's a lot like the bond market. Prices rise, yields fall. So what's happening? Investors are paying more for real estate investments. Look for this trend to continue over the next several years. Switching gears to local trends here in Sioux Falls. This is my favorite slide of all. This is new multifamily construction going back to 1871. It's impressive, right? We see a spike in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and in 2016, now that looks like a healthy, modest increase in new multifamily construction. Let's add in Lincoln County. Wow. 1,600 units, new multifamily construction. That's a record, folks. I sense maybe one or two multifamily investors squirming in their seat, maybe a credit officer or two, perhaps. Let's not panic. Michael reported a huge job growth. Reggie reported a huge population growth. Let's look at vacancy. Now, this yellow bar is Sioux Falls multifamily vacancy going back to 2005. Yep, we spiked about 200 basis points from 6% to 8%. Now, in context here, that's a big jump, but let's not panic. However, I believe that bankers, brokers, and investors will keep an eye on this trend. As this trend continues to go up, valuations will eventually fall in multifamily. Let's take a look at sales. This bar here shows sales volume in dollar, going back to all the way to 2006. And the number is transactions 4 units and higher. We peaked in 2015. We're down slightly in terms of total sales volume. However, same number of transactions. But what I want to point out here, if we took away the two largest transactions in our market last year, the sales volume number would collapse in half. Let's take a look at some of these individual transactions. Big deal, $16 million deal, Carrington Apartments, 220 units, 7.8% cap rate. Second big deal, Westbrook Apartments, $6.3 million. This traded at a 7.5% cap rate. Madison Apartments, older project, 76 units, 7.32% cap rate. Majestic View Townhomes, 2.1, 7 3/4. I put this in the presentation for a reason. This is an older project, mid-70s build, 13 units, 6.9% cap rate. You don't see that typically, historically. Usually the older, smaller properties have higher cap rates. Look for this cap rate compression to continue over the next 2 to 3 years. Switching gears to retail, we're just looking at cap rates here. Reggie did a great job in his presentation. $4.8 million, approximately an 8.5% cap rate. Now, I don't believe this was just simply a cap rate driven transaction. The adjacent property owner purchased this, not only for the cash flow, but to control the surrounding real estate. Smart move. 41st and Marion, $1.1 million, traded at an 8.5% cap rate. That's about right. A little bit newer strip mall on South Sycamore, under $1 million, 7.6% cap rate. Okay, switching gears to office again. Andy did a great job with the fundamentals. We're only looking at cap rates here. Big transaction. 2 multi-tenant office buildings, nearly $10 million, 7.45% cap rate. I suspect we're going to be seeing these in appraisals for years to come as a comp. This is a little bit different of an investment transaction. There's 3 buildings there, and this wasn't really bought on a cap rate. There was some vacancy in these properties. The buyer purchased this for $73 a square foot on the hope, on the gamble, that he can fill these vacancies and achieve an above-market return. I threw some slides at you. If you walk away remembering one slide, remember this one. This bar represents the index value of all U.S. commercial real estate. Look at the run-up from 2001 to 2007, of course the crash in 2009, and then look at the run-up that we've had to 2016. What's driving this? Well, number one, we had a good recovery. It was a little shallow, but it's been long, that's great. But the fact that debt is relatively historically cheap. This blue bar is the 10-year treasury going back over the same period. I believe over the next 2 to 3 years, we will continue to see valuations increase. Let's wrap it up here with some predictions. In 2016, sales volume was down in all three asset classes that we covered. In 17, just based on the transactions that have already closed and the transactions that we're placing under contract now, I believe we're going to be up in all three asset classes. And I say that with some confidence. Cap rates in 2017 will be between 6.5% to 7.8% in multifamily, 7.5% to 8% in office, 6.75% to 8.5% in retail. Right now, we're at a peak in valuation demand. If you own a property or you have a client that owns a property and they think they may want to sell over the next 3 to 5 years, now would be a great time to sell. It's a great market to sell in. But I don't want to paint a picture that it's all bad for buyers. Interest rates are historically low, and these slides with all these deals show that good deals are still out there. Everyone who I'm talking to, sellers, buyers, investors, are pretty bullish right now. It's a great opportunity to take advantage of it. In this real estate cycle, this isn't the general investment cycle. This is primarily focused on multifamily. Over the last 17, 20 years, there's been really 2 10-year cycles from peak to trough. As Sioux Falls continues to grow aggressively, and low populations and jobs, look for these 10-year cycles to compress down to more of a 6 to 8-year process. Thank you very much.
Came to the falls on the Big Sioux River, where white water rushed over quartzite and jasper, giving life to the prairie, giving birth to a city. They came from the east, in search of open spaces, in search of adventure, in search of opportunity. Builders, merchants, artists, and trailblazers. They shaped the landscape of Sioux Falls, like the river on which it was built, carving the city's path into the future, with dreams, with vision, with determination. They came to build, grow, and to thrive. They were pioneers, connected by an enduring spirit that continues to flow through our dynamic city. Sioux Falls does not have one history. The stories of each man and woman, each stumble, challenge, and success, come together to tell the history of Sioux Falls.
Whether they were pioneers or whether they're newly arrived, they all come here with dreams, and they all come here hoping that they can build a beautiful future for their children. And when you have that in your heart, you make a big investment in the community you're living in.
You learned to work on the farm. Before you went to school, you got up and did chores. And that work ethic sticks with you. Maybe it's generational, maybe not, but we certainly learned to work. My father worked until he was 87 years old, and then retired. So that's ingrained in us. I think it's probably part of our genetic code.
Kind of the combination of different generations of business people here, along with the new corporate arrivals who got involved in the community, who contributed along with those that were here in business, and developed a real culture within this community to want to meet and exceed expectations.
It's always amazing to talk to people that come to Sioux Falls and they say, it's just assumed that you're going to get involved in the arts. It's just assumed that you're going to get involved in city policy and all the other things that make Sioux Falls an absolutely wonderful community to live in.
I think it's been important that the city has taken a leadership role in creating centers of economic activity.
That whole period of time during the 90s when we were really challenging ourselves to become more competitive. And then in 1998, Sioux Falls Convention Center. Also, 1999, the Washington Pavilion opened. The Event Center, 2014. Certainly that is a real game changer. It's a tremendous asset for the Sioux Falls area and the state of South Dakota.
When I think about quality of life, I have to think about Phillips Sioux Falls, the park system. I have to think about the pavilion and the growth in the arts community like Jazz Fest and Sculpture Walk. I also think about the investment that our community has made in bringing new businesses to town. And of course, I do think about the East Bank and all of the changes on the Big Sioux River and all of the little shops and restaurants that have opened up in town over the last 20 years.
Bender Commercial Real Estate played a leading role in this story as the city grew and new businesses opened their doors. The company's leadership embraced a philosophy and work ethic that reflects the values of Sioux Falls and resonates with the people that choose to call it home. Everyone at Bender is committed to acquiring a thorough knowledge of the marketplace and applying that knowledge to offer their clients the best path to success. They are invested in these clients, this city, and the extraordinary stories yet to be told.
Well, the future is very, very positive, and we're starting to compete very effectively in all levels, whether we're talking about economic development, whether we're talking about visitor development. We're getting those kinds of things that define a quality of life for people of all demographics.
And we see the investment generation after generation after generation has been made, whether it's in new investment that's good for your company or new investments into the community and the quality of life, and that will continue. Pessimists have never won. There's no reason not to be optimistic about Sioux Falls.
And I would say in the last 5 years, we've really seen a renaissance. I would expect that to continue, and I don't think any of us can even imagine 5 and 10 years from now how much better it will be as we go forward.
I think one of the most amazing things about Sioux Falls is that we continue to build on that legacy. It's really been an unbroken stream, and you can really see that. You can kind of see how each iteration and each generation builds on the success of the previous one.
Today, we celebrate these stories, and the people at Bender Commercial Real Estate are helping them unfold. And like the river, your dreams, vision, and enduring spirit flow through our city, setting the course for an exciting future. As we all celebrate Sioux Falls, we celebrate you.
Well, if you can now, come on stage and help us celebrate Sioux Falls.